My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter while the late afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching dust in the air and making everything look softer than it felt. I remember the smell of baked apples, the low hum of the refrigerator, and the way my hands froze the second I realized what I was hearing. In that quiet room, with my house exactly the way it had always been, my understanding of my own children cracked wide open. If you're listening to this and you've ever trusted someone without question, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this don't start loud. They start in silence. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with a slow, sinking clarity. Something I could never unhear had just settled into my bones. In that moment, I understood that love doesn't always protect you, and family doesn't always mean safety. That was the moment everything I believed began to unravel. I was standing alone in my kitchen, waiting for an apple pie to cool, when my phone vibrated on the counter and split my life in two. The house was quiet in that soft afternoon way, sunlight on the sink, flour still on my hands, grief resting where it had lived since my husband died. I am Linda Parker, 64 years old, widowed for 3 years, and until that moment I believed my children were the safest place I had left. The message played before I even thought to stop it. I heard my son's voice, careless and irritated, speaking as if I were already gone. Not worried, not loving, just tired of me existing. My chest tightened so fast it felt like my body understood the truth before my mind did. The kitchen felt smaller, colder, unfamiliar, like I had stepped into someone else's house. I remember staring at the pie and thinking how strange it was that I had made it with so much love for someone who spoke about me with none. In that quiet space, something inside me went still. I realized I wasn't overhearing a bad moment. I was seeing the reality I had refused to see. That accidental message didn't just hurt me, it rewrote my past and forced me to question everything. I used to believe my family was the part of my life that stayed solid no matter what. I had been married for 37 years, the kind of marriage built on routine, compromise, and quiet loyalty. My husband and I grew older together in the same house, raised our children there, and planned a future we assumed we would share until the end. When he died, the world didn't shatter all at once. It slowly emptied. Evenings stretched too long. Decisions felt heavier. Silence became something I carried room to room. I told myself that this was just the season of grief, and that the center of my life would shift toward my children instead. I believed that was natural. They were grown, busy, living their own lives, but they were still my anchors. I trusted their concern. I leaned into their advice. When they checked in, I felt seen. When they suggested changes, I assumed it came from love. I wanted to believe that family meant safety, especially after loss. Looking back, I can admit how vulnerable I was. I needed closeness so badly that I didn't question tone or timing. I told myself that any unease was just loneliness talking. Grief has a way of softening your instincts, of convincing you that comfort matters more than clarity. At the time, everything felt normal enough. But now I can see how fragile that sense of security really was, and how the cracks had already begun to form. I hadn't noticed them then, but they were there all along. I didn't notice the change all at once. It came quietly, wrapped in concern, the kind that sounds reasonable when you're lonely. Phone calls grew shorter. Visits felt scheduled instead of spontaneous. There was less laughter and more checking in, as if they were keeping notes instead of memories. The focus of our conversations shifted. We talked less about how I was feeling and more about how I was managing. My house, my routines, my future plans all became regular topics. It wasn't aggressive. It was framed as responsibility. I told myself this was what grown children did when they worried. When finances came up, I brushed off the tightness in my chest. When age was mentioned, I reminded myself that 64 sounded older than it felt. When they talked about planning ahead, I convinced myself they were just being practical. Grief makes you grateful for attention, even when it feels slightly wrong. There were moments that unsettled me. I noticed how often my independence was questioned, how advice slowly replaced listening. I felt myself becoming defensive without knowing why. Still, I swallowed the discomfort. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or suspicious. I wanted to believe love explained everything. Looking back, I see how often I chose comfort over clarity. Each small moment felt harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I refused to name. I was being evaluated, not supported, but I wasn't ready to admit it. By the time my instincts finally spoke louder than my fear of being alone, it was already too late. The truth was waiting, and it was about to arrive in a way I could no longer ignore. And in that silence, I sensed something irreversible was coming, even before I understood what it would cost me completely forever. I replayed the message over and over, standing perfectly still, as if moving might break whatever fragile balance I had left. It wasn't shouted or dramatic. That was what hurt most. The tone was casual, impatient, spoken as though my life were an inconvenience instead of a human presence. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. My hands went cold. My chest felt hollow. The kitchen clock kept ticking, loud and ordinary, while everything I believed about my family quietly collapsed. I remember realizing I wasn't confused anymore. Confusion had been replaced by something far clearer and far heavier. What I heard wasn't a moment of frustration. It was familiarity with an idea they had already accepted. There was no hesitation, no concern, no trace of love layered underneath. That was when the denial finally let go of me. I understood that the kindness I thought I felt had been performance, and that the pressure I dismissed had been intention. The pain didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as calm. A sharp, steady awareness settled in. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. I was finally seeing the truth without grief softening the edges. In that moment, I stopped waiting for reassurance that would never come. I stopped hoping for an explanation that would make it hurt less. Something inside me closed, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. They believed I was unprepared and unaware. They were wrong. And as the message faded, something else quietly came to life, and it changed everything that followed forever. I sat down at the kitchen table and thought about my husband, Mark, and the conversations I used to wave off with a smile. He had always been practical, sometimes uncomfortably so. He believed that money changed people, and that love didn't always survive entitlement. Back then, I thought he was just cautious. I didn't want to imagine a future where protection mattered more than trust. But Mark did imagine it, quietly, carefully. During his last years, he made sure plans were in place that I barely paid attention to. Trusts, safeguards, conditions designed to protect me if anyone ever tried to pressure or control my decisions. I signed papers without reading closely, assuming they were for emergencies that would never come. Standing there after the message, I finally understood what he had been doing for me. He wasn't preparing for strangers. He was preparing for the possibility that even family could fail me. That realization didn't break me. It steadied me. I pulled out the folder I had ignored for years and read it slowly. Everything was clear. I was not powerless. My choices were protected. My independence had teeth. Fear loosened its grip and was replaced by something calmer and far more useful. For the first time since hearing that message, I felt grounded. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. I made one phone call, not in anger, but in certainty. From that moment on, I stopped wondering what they might do next. I already knew what I was going to do. The fear that once defined me dissolved, replaced by resolve, patience, and a quiet confidence I hadn't felt since Mark was still alive. Then before, I invited them over on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind that used to make me nervous. They arrived with practiced smiles and familiar ease, moving through my home as if it already belonged to them. On the surface, everything looked normal. Inside, nothing was. I noticed things I used to miss. How their eyes moved before their bodies did, scanning rooms, lingering on documents, shelves, doors. How they sat without waiting. How suggestions slipped in, dressed as concern. I felt no urge to explain myself. That surprised me most. Before, I would have tried to prove I was capable. I would have softened my words, laughed things off, reached for connection. This time, I listened instead. I listened to what wasn't said. I listened to the assumptions hanging in the air, heavy and impatient. They spoke as if decisions were already made, timelines already agreed upon. I watched entitlement surface in small ways, a confidence that came from believing I was unaware. Each moment confirmed what I already knew. I felt calm, almost detached, like an observer finally allowed to see clearly. The house felt different to me then. It wasn't a place I needed to protect emotionally. It was simply a setting. When my phone vibrated in my pocket, I didn't flinch. I already knew who it would be. The message was brief and confirming. Everything was in order. Everything was documented. I slipped the phone back without reacting, letting the moment pass. I let the quiet stretch, feeling patience settle deeper. Knowing silence often invites people to reveal more than questions ever could in moments like this now. That was when I understood it was time. They had walked in, believing they were in control. I was about to show them how wrong that belief truly was. I set my hands flat on the table and told them that some things had already been handled. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself. I simply stated that decisions about my life and my estate were no longer open for discussion. The room changed instantly. I could feel it before I saw it. The easy posture disappeared. The confidence tightened into something brittle. I recognized it then for what it was. It wasn't concern draining away. It was access. I felt strangely calm, clear. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their energy. I was setting the temperature. I watched them search my face for reassurance I wasn't offering, for permission I wasn't giving. In that quiet stretch, I understood how often love had been confused with entitlement, how easily my vulnerability had been mistaken for weakness. The shock I sensed wasn't about losing me. It was about losing control over outcomes they had already counted on. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I let the silence do the work. Silence has a way of revealing who expects compliance and who respects boundaries. As I sat there, steady and unmoved, I felt the balance shift fully into place. This was only the first truth. The larger one was still waiting, heavier and undeniable, and I could feel it pressing forward, ready to end whatever doubt they had left. I remained composed, knowing that once everything surfaced, nothing could be taken back, and the final illusion protecting them from consequences would finally disappear for good forever there. I laid everything out slowly, not as an accusation, but as fact. Documents, timelines, records that showed conversations and plans I was never meant to hear. I watched their faces as understanding settled in, heavy and unavoidable. There was no room left for explanations, no place to hide behind concern or misunderstanding. The room went quiet in a way that felt permanent. I noticed how certainty drained from their posture, how urgency replaced confidence. What struck me most was not anger, but the absence of remorse. The weight in the air wasn't about hurting me, it was about being exposed. In that silence, something inside me finally let go. I stopped searching their faces for signs of the children I raised. I stopped hoping there was a version of this that could still be softened. Grief arrived, steady and complete, not sharp but final. I understood then that trust doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes, piece by piece, until there is nothing left to defend. What remained wasn't hatred, it was clarity, clear boundaries, clear endings. I didn't explain further. I didn't negotiate. There was nothing left to clarify. The truth had done its work without my help. As I gathered the papers back into their folder, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't victory. It was acceptance. The moment where illusion ends and reality begins. When I stood up, I knew this chapter was closed. Whatever came next would be quieter, lonelier perhaps, but it would be honest. And honesty, I realized, was the only ground I was willing to stand on now. I carried that certainty with me as I walked away, knowing I no longer owed explanations, forgiveness, or access to anyone who had mistaken my silence for surrender at last today. Finally. After they left, the house settled into a silence that felt earned, not empty, not heavy, just still. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to my own breathing, noticing how steady it was. I had expected to feel shattered or guilty. Instead, I felt present. I walked back to the kitchen and turned off the oven, even though nothing was inside it anymore. It was a small thing, but it mattered. It reminded me that I was still here, still responsible for my own space, my own pace. My hands didn't shake. My thoughts didn't race. What surprised me most was the absence of regret. I didn't replay the conversation or imagine better outcomes. I didn't wonder if I had been too firm or too cold. I understood, finally, that protecting myself was not cruelty. It was respect. I sat at the table where everything had unfolded and let the quiet stay. Sadness came, but it was clean, not chaotic. It felt like grief that had finished arguing with reality. I missed the family I thought I had, but I no longer missed the version of myself who kept shrinking to hold them together. That night, I folded the papers back into their folder and placed it in the drawer where it belonged. I washed the last dish in the sink and turned out the light. As I stood there in the dark, I realized this wasn't the end of understanding. It was the calm before truth surfaced, one that would change how I saw my children. Over the next few days, pieces began to surface that I hadn't been looking for, but couldn't ignore anymore. I learned there had been conversations held without me, plans discussed long before concern ever reached my ears. What I first thought was confusion revealed itself as coordination. Patterns emerged once I stopped defending them in my mind. Repeated attempts to gather information, subtle efforts to isolate me from outside voices, moments where urgency replaced patience. It became clear this wasn't panic, it was strategy. The most unsettling part wasn't what they wanted, but how far they were willing to go to get it. Boundaries meant nothing. Truth was flexible. My well-being was secondary to outcomes they believed they deserved. That realization changed something fundamental in me. This was no longer about hurt feelings or broken trust. It was about safety. Mine. I felt sadness. Yes. But it was quickly overtaken by resolve. The children I raised would never have crossed these lines. Accepting that truth was like grieving them while they were still alive. I stopped hoping for apologies. I stopped waiting for remorse. What I needed now was protection, not reconciliation. By the end of that week, I understood that time was no longer neutral. Waiting would only invite more pressure. I had reached the point where firmness wasn't optional. It was necessary. And with that clarity, I knew the next step would not be quiet. I was done hesitating, done doubting, and fully prepared to confront them one last time with absolute clarity and no fear remaining. We met in a conference room downtown, neutral and bare, chosen because it carried no memories. The long table, the empty walls, the quiet hum of the building all signaled that this was not a family discussion. It was an ending. I sat upright, steady, feeling none of the nerves that used to betray me. I laid out everything methodically. Documents, timelines, verified records. I watched comprehension settle in as the structure they had relied on collapsed. Their confidence gave way to agitation, then disbelief. I noticed how quickly composure vanished once manipulation stopped working. That observation alone told me everything I needed to know. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I refused every attempt to redirect or soften what was being revealed. I stayed calm, because calm leaves no room for distortion. For the first time, I was not the one trying to hold the family together. I was the one drawing the line. As the facts landed, I saw fear surface, not of losing me, but of losing leverage. That distinction mattered. It freed me. I understood that nothing I said could repair what had already been chosen by them long before this room. I stated my boundaries clearly. Access was ending. Decisions were final. Any further pressure would be handled through formal channels, not emotional ones. I felt no guilt saying it. Boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. In that moment, I chose myself without apology. I chose safety, clarity, and dignity over the illusion of harmony. I gathered my papers, stood, and felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. As I walked out, I knew this chapter was closed. What waited ahead was not easy, but it would be honest, and it would finally be mine. Life after they were gone felt strangely quiet, like the air after a storm has passed. At first, the silence was sharp. I noticed it in the mornings, in the empty space where routine conversations used to live. There were moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, not just for my children, but for the future I had imagined with them still in it. Loneliness did arrive, and I didn't pretend it didn't. Some evenings felt long. Some memories still ached. But alongside that sadness was something new and steady. Peace. A sense of not being watched, measured, or managed. I could breathe again without explaining myself. Slowly, my days began to belong to me. I rearranged rooms because I wanted to. I made plans without checking in. I spent time with people who listened instead of assessed. Small choices started to feel meaningful again, reminders that my life was still unfolding. I learned that boundaries don't erase love, but they do protect dignity. I learned that walking away can be an act of self-respect, not failure. Most of all, I learned that my worth was never dependent on being needed or controlled. There were still waves of sadness, but they no longer knocked me down. They passed through, leaving understanding behind. I felt steadier, more grounded, less afraid of being alone than I had ever been while surrounded by the wrong people. As time moved forward, I stopped defining my life by what I had lost. I began to see what I had gained: clarity, autonomy, a quiet confidence that came from choosing myself. And when I looked back on everything that had happened, I realized I was finally ready to speak about what it all meant, not in anger, but in truth. I didn't expect this chapter of my life to teach me so much about myself. I thought the lesson would be about betrayal, or loss, or how quickly trust can disappear. Instead, it became about worth, about the quiet strength it takes to stop explaining your boundaries to people who benefit from crossing them. I learned that love without respect slowly erases you. That family does not earn unlimited access simply because of blood, and that choosing yourself, especially later in life, is not selfish. It is necessary. Letting go was painful. There was no honesty in pretending otherwise, but what came after was clarity. Space to breathe. Space to hear my own thoughts again. What I lost in illusion, I gained in peace. This space exists so stories like ours can finally breathe. If you are listening to this and feeling that familiar tightness in your chest, wondering if you are overreacting or if asking for respect is asking too much, I want you to hear this clearly. Your instincts matter. Your boundaries matter. You do not have to sacrifice your dignity to keep the peace. Thank you for sitting with my story until the end. If any part of it felt familiar or stirred something you've been carrying quietly, I invite you to share it in the comments. Have you ever had to choose yourself when it felt impossible? I read every message, and you are not alone.